Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. U.S. President Donald Trump has delivered a nationally televised address amid continued fighting between the U.S. and Iran. While much of the speech focused on his renewed claims of Chinese interference in the 2020 election, he said relatively little about the ongoing war, prompting fresh political debate. Now, at the same time, the conflict continues to evolve, raising questions about its direction and the prospects for diplomacy. To discuss both the political and security implications, we're joined by two guests tonight. First, Christophe Gaudin, professor of political science at Kookmin University. A big welcome.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
And also joining us is Seunghoon, researcher of Institute of Middle East Studies. Good to see you.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So, let's start a discussion right away. First with Professor Gaudin. So, like I've said, during the latest address, President Trump once again claimed that China interfered in the 2020 U.S. election. Why do you think he's bringing back the election fraud claims right now, just a couple of months before the November midterms?
Because basically the context looks very grim to President Trump. First, the domestic context, with the midterm elections, so kicking in November. These elections in America, as you know, historically, have always been an occasion for American citizens to voice their discontent. So this discontent is higher than ever, not mostly because of the war in Iran, but because of inflation that is skyrocketing in America for many reasons, but partly because of the tariffs implemented by the Trump administration, and also, as you explained in your little introduction, because of the domestic, not only the domestic, but the international context, So that is this war in Iran that Trump started almost single-handedly. And as far as we can tell, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. So when in trouble, Trump does unfortunately, what he always does. He's trying to dodge the issue. He's trying to look for a scapegoat, in this case, China, and he's going back to his own narratives about the 2020 election that would have been allegedly stolen. All of this is about dodging the issue. Something interesting is that this national address was meant to be about the situation in Iran. And as you mentioned again in your introduction, Trump discussed almost everything but the situation in Iran, which I think is self-explanatory, eloquent enough in itself.
We'll go back to the Trump speech, the portion of Iran as we speak. But building on this, the Democrats first called the entire speech an attack on democracy, and some major American broadcasters didn't actually air it live. What impact could this speech have on political polarization and the midterm elections, Professor Gaudin?
What is interesting in the first place, as you mentioned again, is that major broadcasters, so politically neutral broadcasters, have decided not to air it live. So that's very interesting in itself, because it means that all these broadcasters have come to consider their own president as a threat to American democracy. What is happening now, I think, is unfortunately quite transparent. Trump is trying to build on polarization in order to disguise his own failures, either domestically or internationally. So, of course, as you mentioned in your question, there is a risk to increase polarization in America. That said, however, I wonder, to be honest, if anybody is still listening to Trump but his own supporters. I would incline to say that, unfortunately, damage is done already, and I'm afraid that now, in this situation, nothing Trump can say or do can actually make the situation any worse. America can hardly be more polarized than it is already, unfortunately.
So we'll see how voters took this come November. Now, if we turn to Iran, President Trump only briefly mentioned the war, saying the U.S. is winning and that the results will soon be very clear. Dr. Paik, why do you think he stopped short of mentioning more?
Because President Trump highlighted victory but avoided to defining it. Because the more clear he defines the war objectives, the more directly he becomes responsible for its costs, duration, and outcomes. I think the fact that President Trump devoted only one brief line of Iran was itself highly revealing. So he wanted this address to be remembered primarily as a domestic political speech about election integrity and political legitimacy, not as a wartime address in which he assumed full responsibility for increasingly costly conflicts. So if he had focused extensively on Iran, President Trump would have been expected to answer several difficult questions, such as what exactly is the military objectives? Is it only to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, or is it also to control over the Strait of Hormuz, or weakening the Iranian regimes and secure freedom of navigation? How long will the operation continue? What constitutes the victories? And what is the exit strategies? I mean, those questions are difficult to answer because the goals of the campaign appears to have expanded over the time. So the war, as we go back to February 28th, the war began with an emphasis on Iranian nuclear and missile infrastructures, but it has increasingly become a conflict over the Strait of Hormuz, commercial shipping, Iran ports, and security of American bases throughout the region. So Washington's objectives have shifted over time, while the collapse of the ceasefire has exposed unresolved disagreement over the Strait and Iran's nuclear program. So by saying only that United States is winning and the American will soon see the result, President Trump can claim political credit without defining measurable benchmark. So if Iran eventually returns to negotiation, he can say the military campaign forced Tehran back to the negotiation table. If Iran continues to resist, he can argue that further attacks are needed to complete the victories. So, and also it is also a form of strategic ambiguity. So Trump does not want to publicly commit himself to a specific timetable or particular end state because that he would restrict his freedom of action. So my assessment is that this was an effort to control the political ownership of the war. So President Trump wants to project a victory without allowing the increasingly complicated military situation to dominate his domestic political message. So that's why the reason he kind of like downplayed and he only mentioned just one line about like Iranian warfare and just boosting about we are still winning and we're going to get the result that we want in the short, brief time.
So this very short message was rather strategic from President Trump's point. But if we look deeper into the situation, Dr. Paik, U.S. casualties actually continue to mount, including 2 American service members killed on the 17th, we believe. So given how the war has unfolded so far, how convincing is President Trump's claim that the U.S. is winning right now?
So, as you mentioned, I mean, it depends on what we mean by winning. So, at the tactical level, the United States is clearly demonstrating military superiority. It can conduct repeated strikes deep inside Iran, damage missile and drone infrastructures, target coastal surveillances and air defense system, and maintain substantial air and maritime power around the region. But tactical superiority is not the same as strategic victory. Strategically, the record is much more mixed. Iran retained the ability to strike American bases and regional partners with missiles and drones. As you mentioned, 2 U.S. service members were killed in Jordan on July 17th while defending against Iranian missile and drone attack. And another service member was initially reported missing. So by July 18th, the total numbers of U.S. military deaths during the war had reached 17 with more than 400 personnel reportedly wounded. So Iran and still are continuing to attack U.S. positions and American partner in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, and even after months of U.S. and Israel strike. So the United States has also not yet achieved several of the outcomes that would normally define strategic victory. First, the nuclear question remains unresolved. So Iran nuclear capabilities still are there. And second, the Strait of Hormuz has not been reliably reopened. It is closed, and we see no ship trespassing. And third, the conflict has expanded geographically rather than contracted. U.S. allies and facilities across the Gulf have come under attack, and civilian infrastructures, including power and water facilities, have increasingly been drawn into a conflict. And fourth, the June memorandum did not produce a durable political settlement. So a war is not won simply because one side can destroy more targets. Strategic victories means compelling the opponent to change its behavior at the politically and economically acceptable cost. So far, Iran has not been weakened, but it has not capitulated. It continues to retaliate, disrupts shipping, and reject American-defined settlements. So therefore, President Trump can credibly claim that the United States is winning many military engagement, but it is premature to say that the United States is winning by war strategically because it's still ongoing and we haven't seen the objectives that has been derived or which United States always claim started from the beginning.
Right, a very important point that we've made, Dr. Baek, that the definition of winning would be very crucial at this point. Now, if we circle back to Washington earlier this week, President Trump has formally notified the Congress that military operations against Iran has resumed. Does that suggest the administration is preparing for a much longer campaign? Professor Gaudin.
Sorry. My bad. Long story short, yes. And so what is concerning about this is that normally in the American constitutional order, in the first place, the Congress should be to authorize these military actions before they are taken by the president, so as the commander-in-chief of military forces. Here, in your question, what I find to be most concerning is that the Congress, so the Republican majority in Congress, seems to be running after President Trump. President Trump seems to be running this war almost by himself, single-handedly. And as Dr. Paik mentioned before me, basically a war ends with a strategic victory. And a strategic victory means that, long story short, you can compel your opponent to do as you say. But if you don't say what you're after, then therefore these negotiations cannot come to an end. So what is happening now is that the US Congress, what can the US Congress do? Two things. Either they vote against these operations to stop them, which is not to happen because the Republican majority in this Congress, to be clear, is basically made of President Trump's goons. We've seen what happened to all Republicans, like Liz Cheney, for instance, who tried to stand up against Trump. It never ended well. So what they can only do is to follow President Trump. And President Trump is giving them no direction to follow, which is how we ended in this then end. Long story short, unfortunately.
But Professor Gaudin, speaking of direction, which is quite unclear, I think many of us are confused right now. As far as we recall, the war began with a stated goal of targeting Iran's nuclear program. But now it seems as if the focus is, has shifted to the Strait of Hormuz. So with growing criticism at home, what does President Trump actually need to do to justify the situation?
I'm not sure he knows himself, to be frank. This war started with one single clear objective, which was overthrowing the Islamic Republic in Iran. This, as we can tell, failed, because in the bigger picture, ending the Iranian nuclear program and putting an end to the Islamic Republic, in the bigger picture, these are one and same, because this nuclear program is the creation of the Islamic Republic. So what happened, in fact, in the bigger picture, is that quite cleverly, the mullahs in Iran decided to shift the objective of the war. Instead of fighting back, because of course, as Dr. Beck mentioned, Iran has the military capacity to hit American bases in the Emirates, in Qatar, in Kuwait, etc., but nothing further. So what Iran decided to do was basically to block the Strait of Hormuz in order to change the terms of the war. And so this, I think, the Trump administration had never considered to be possible. What happened, long story short, is that the Trump administration decided to launch this war in order to basically put an end to this regime in Iran. And this regime in Iran, as they are not able to strike back directly against America, decided very cleverly, strategically speaking, to shift the terms of the war by blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And this is how the Trump administration has ended in a trap that I think nobody had been considering in the first place. To put an end to this, America will need to dispatch troops in the Middle East, which will mean many American lives to be lost, and the US is not ready for that. Look, yesterday and the day before, like 3 American soldiers died, and look at the uproar that followed in America. The American public is not ready to have American lives lost. In countries, many American citizens are not able to locate on a map. As simple as that.
So the situation is worse than many have been expecting. So after this latest U.S. strikes, another concerning comment is Iran's Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei vowed a stronger response regarding the situation. Dr. Beck, how likely is it that it would escalate into a full-scale war?
So the possibility of a full-scale war is real and has increased considerably. But I would distinguish between a growing risk of a full-scale war and most likely immediate scenarios. So the statement attributed to Mojtaba Khamenei reflects the broader position of Iran's hardline security establishment. Repeated diplomatic efforts have failed, American pressure has continued, and Iran therefore believes that restraint has produced no meaningful benefit. So the message is politically important because it authorized a more aggressive posture by the Revolutionary Guards and other Iranian military institutions. So the risk is particularly high because the conflict has entered that we might call the escalation ladder. So the first lung is the repeated exchange of limited strike, such as the United States attacks Iranian missile drone and coastal and logistical infrastructures, and Iran response against regional bases or maritime targets. The second lung is attack producing significant American casualty, which is now we are entering. So the death of U.S. service members creates strong domestic and institutional pressure on Washington to retaliate decisively. Iran may intend a limited response, but missile and drones are inherently difficult to calibrate. So on attack intended to be symbolic could kill dozens of American and trigger much larger U.S. operation. The third lung would involve attacks on strategically existential or targets. A U.S. attempt to seize Iranian territory such as Kharak Island, which is a major strike on deep underground nuclear, or a major strike on deep underground nuclear facilities, or Iran attacks on critical Gulf energy, electric cities, and desalination infrastructures. But thankfully, we are not yet on this third lung. So, and fortunately, both governments still have powerful reason to avoid total war. Iran knows that a full conventional war would expose its military, energy, and governmental infrastructure to overwhelming American firepower. The United States knows that the invasion or occupation would require extensive forces, produce substantial casualty, raises oil prices, and potentially generate another prolonged Middle Eastern war. So that is why the most likely scenario remains neither peace nor immediate all-out war. It is a protracted, high-intensity limited war with repeated airstrike, missile attacks, maritime incidents, and intermittent diplomatic contracts. But the buffer separating limited war from full-scale war is becoming dangerously thin. That's what I'm really concerned about. So I would say the probability of full-scale war is no longer remote. It may still be avoidable, but it could be triggered not by a deliberate decision to start a total war, but by a mass casualty incident or miscalculation or an attack that crosses an opponent's perceived red line. So that is most the dangerous situation that we are facing, and that is most like concern that I have during this kind of like exchange of the attack between United States and Iran.
Right. So if I understood it right, it seems like we're really walking on very thin ice right now. So given this current situation, Dr. Paik, do you think there's any, room or someone or something that could bring the both sides back to the table?
Yes, mediation is still possible, but it is unlikely to be conducted successfully by one country acting alone. So the fact that traditional mediated states that have themselves come under attack makes diplomacy far more difficult. Qatar has confirmed intercepting Iranian missiles, while Oman has also faced attacks on or near its territory during the broader conflict. So although responsibility for some incident involving Oman has been disrupted, these events damages the perception of a neutral diplomatic space and place domestic pressure on mediator government to take firmer position, not just to be like naive and keep on bridging between Iran and United States. So the most plausible principal political mediator is currently Pakistan. Pakistan helped broker the June framework and maintain working channels with both Washington and Tehran. But Pakistan also has its limitation because, their close defense relation with Saudi Arabia, and as Iranian and Houthi attack place Saudi territory under greater pressure, Islamabad may find it increasingly difficult to present itself as a complete neutral. And Egypt and Turkey could provide supplementary political channel because both maintain relation with Tehran while also having access to Washington and Gulf government. But however, neither Turkey nor Egypt alone is likely to be fully trusted by every party. So therefore, the best model would be multi-layered contract group rather than one heroic mediator. So I do believe we need not only just one heroic mediator, but Qatar, the Turkey and Egypt and Kuwait, all this like Pakistan, all people, the state needs to play their role to actually bring this two-party to a negotiation table. But if it's not, it is very difficult to get this negotiation get started.
A very important point. So we'll really have to watch whether diplomacy through collective action still has a path forward. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Dr. Paik.
Pleasure is mine.
And of course, Professor Gaudin, we really appreciate it.
Thanks. Pleasure's mine too.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.